Today we're making a classic zippered box pouch. It works as a travel pouch packed with your toiletries or an EDC kit for everyday carry. Same pouch, different day, and you can make it yourself. I'm Taylor, welcome to Taylor. This channel is about sewing your own bags and gear from everyday carry pouches to totes and slings. This pouch has a timeless construction that shows up everywhere in bag making. And once you know how to build one of these, you'll use this skill over and over. There are no curves to sew. If you can sew a straight line, you can handle this project. All you need is a regular sewing machine and a few basic tools. In this video, you'll learn how to sew a zipper, how to finish your seams with a binding tape, and how to sew a French seam, as well as the fundamentals of box pouch construction. I've got a pattern for this pouch at taylortaylor.com with full written instructions and diagrams to go along with this video. The link is in the description below. But even if you don't have the pattern yet or you're not ready to sew today, stick around. You'll pick up techniques you can use on a lot of projects. I'll show you everything step by step. Let's get into it. Okay, so the very first thing we need to do is get our pattern together. And I have a link for this pattern on my website, taylortaylor.com. There's a link in the description below. There's really just two pieces to the pattern. This is the main piece. It's kind of the classic box pouch shape, and it's marked with seam allowance and it's marked with pocket placement. The other piece to the pattern is the pocket. There's two pockets on the inside and two pockets on the outside of the pouch. And the important thing to know here is that it's the same pattern piece for both the inside and the outside pockets, but the inside pockets are just a little bit smaller so that we can hide those stitches behind the bigger pocket on the outside of the pouch. So in order to do that, I've got fold lines all the way around this pocket piece. So basically all you have to do to cut the inside pockets is to fold this pattern piece 1/2 inch on each side. The inside pockets are just 1 inch smaller than the outside pockets. Okay, so the next step is to cut out your pattern. And I've done that here. And you can see you just need one piece of each. You got the main pouch piece here, the outside pocket, and the slightly smaller inside pocket. And I'm saying pocket, but there's really two flat pockets on the outside of the pouch and two flat pockets on the inside of the pouch. But you just need one of each pocket piece because the pattern, the pockets will be divided with these lines on the pattern later in the construction. The pockets are optional. You don't actually have to put these on if you don't want to. You could just sew this whole pouch with this main outside piece and you would have a perfectly functional pouch. These pockets add two flat pockets to the outside and two flat pockets to the inside. You could do just the outside pockets or just the inside pockets. If you only do the inside pockets, then you're going to see those stitches on the outside of the pouch. So the outside pockets cover up those stitches. Okay, so in terms of what fabric you might want to use for your pouch, I would recommend something in the medium weight range, something that's like 5 to 10 ounces per square yard. I'm using this EcoPack 400 fabric. It's a really great fabric. It's waterproof, it's made from recycled materials, and to be honest, it's probably overkill for a pouch like this, but I really like it. I have some and I'm going to use it. So the outside, the right side of my fabric, the side that's going to be on the outside of my pouch is this nice kind of plain gray. The wrong side, the inside of my pouch, is going to be this, and you can kind of tell it has these blue X's on it. That's some fibers that give this fabric a lot of strength. Let's go over just a few more things that we're going to need and want for this project. You need a piece of 15¼ inch zipper tape, and the pattern calls for a number 5 nylon coil zipper tape. And that just means that the width of the zipper teeth here is 5 millimeters wide. It also means that the zipper tape itself is 1¼ inch wide, and that's going to be important later on when we are sewing the zipper. We also need at least one, but possibly 2 zipper pulls. That if you want to be able to open the pouch from both sides, with 2 zipper pulls, you'll be able to do that, but only one is really necessary. You'll also need a couple of pieces of 3/4 inch grosgrain ribbon seam tape. Now these are optional. We need a way to finish the zipper pouch seam, and one way of doing that is just sewing a basic zigzag stitch on your sewing machine or serging those edges if you have a serger. but if not, then I would recommend using this seam tape to finish that seam. And I'm going to show you how to do it. It's a really common bag making technique, and it's something that it's good to practice it here because the seam is going to be straight, and seam tape is pretty common in a lot of bag making. The other optional thing you might want here are a couple pieces of paracord. This is just basic nylon paracord, and later on, once the pouch is finished, in the very last step, we will tie this onto these zipper pulls to give them a little bit more of a handle and make them not so loud and jangly sounding. The other thing we're going to need, and this is also optional, a couple more pieces of seam tape, and these later will be folded in half, sewn, and installed in the side seams to give you a way to hang this pouch if you wanted to. These are just meant to form a couple of loops. They can also be used as zipper pull tabs, so when you open and close the zipper, you have something to hold on to. Lastly, in terms of materials, I've got a piece of a hook and loop here. This is 1 3/4 by 1 3/4, and we could put this on one of the pockets as an option later if you want to be able to put a patch on your pouch. That's tough to say. As far as tools go, we've got a seam ripper here. I always make mistakes, so this is nice to have handy. I've got a ruler here. I always have a ruler to check seam allowance and just to make sure that I'm getting everything correct. And I've got a couple pairs of scissors. I also have a chalk wheel here. This will be really helpful for marking pocket placement later. And I've got a couple of pattern weights. I also have some of these clips here. These are going to be really helpful for holding this zipper and this seam tape together as we sew with it. So if you don't have everything together yet, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and watch the video. You can kind of see what I'm doing with all of this stuff, and you can come back to it when you have all of your supplies and materials ready. Okay, if you're using a fabric that frays, like a cotton canvas or a denim or anything that's going to be fraying on the edges, the very next step is to finish both pockets, all 4 sides, with a zigzag stitch on a regular home sewing machine or a serger if you have one. I'm going to be doing this on my regular sewing machine here, since I think that's what most people are probably doing on this beginner project. But this is optional if you're using a fabric, actually if you're using a fabric like this EcoPack, or if you're using a nylon Cordura or a Dyneema or an X-Pack type fabric, you can actually skip this step if you're using a fabric that doesn't fray very much. It's not totally necessary, but on any kind of fabric that frays, you absolutely want to try and finish all four edges of both of your pocket pieces, because they're going to be left unfinished if you don't, and they'll eventually just start to fray and fall apart. I covered this in detail in a beginner sewing video that I will link to below, and it shows you exactly how to do that. But in this video, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, kind of show you quickly how it's done. But if you've never done this before, I would highly recommend checking out that video. It's timestamped, so you can go right to that section and learn exactly how to do this. The next step from here, we want to take the short side on both of your pocket pieces, and we want to fold 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to the wrong side. On a fabric like this, we can't use an iron. If we were using a cotton, or if you're using a canvas, something with a natural fiber, you could iron this, but because this stuff is synthetic, an iron will just melt it. So I'm going to measure 3/8 of an inch, and what I really like to do, since we can't use an iron, you can use something kind of hard like the scissor handle, and you can just kind of crease it like this. It's not quite the same as using an iron, but it actually does a pretty decent job of at least making a fold that we can later take to the sewing machine and stitch down. So the next step, we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch that folded seam allowance down. We're going to stitch it 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fold here, and that should catch this folded seam allowance on the other side. I always backtack at the beginning and end of every seam. Okay, so here's what your two pocket pieces should look like at this point. You've got your zigzag stitch on the long sides if you chose to do that, and then each short side should have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance pressed to the back side, and then there should be a 1/4 inch top stitching on this side. The next step from here is to go ahead and press 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to the wrong side on the long sides of your pocket pieces. All right, there we go. We should have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance folded to the back side on each long side of each pocket piece. Okay, so the next step is to transfer the pocket placement markings for the small pocket. And the smaller pocket is going on the inside of your pouch. So that's going to be the wrong side of your fabric. There's two pocket placement lines here, one inside the other, and the interior pocket placement lines are the ones we are using right now. And what I've done, I've actually poked holes in my pattern. You can see them here and here, and I've got that on all four corners of the pocket placement. Then I'm going to take this chalk and I'm going to mark the four corners of the interior pocket placement. This is just the way that I've found to get pattern markings from your paper pattern to your fabric. So I've marked all four corners of the interior pocket placement. And then what I like to do is I like to take a bigger ruler, and I'm going to just draw these lines right on here. And you'll take the smaller of your two pockets, and you can see that it fits right inside those markings. So the next step, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to edge stitch this pocket in place, and we're just going to sew from this corner to this corner. Then we're sewing from this corner to this corner at this point, and that's all we're doing. And you want to try and sew very close to this edge. If you have an edge stitching mark on your presser foot or on your machine, I would use that, but try to shoot for a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch over from the edge of the pocket. And we're just going to stitch this right in place right now. If you get to the end here and it's kind of thick and your machine's having a hard time with it, it's perfectly fine to hand crank your machine. Okay, I've got the second side under the presser foot, and the key with the second side is to make sure that your pocket lays really flat across here. So even if you're off a little bit with your mark, you want to make sure that anything that the pocket is laying, if it has to lay over the mark a little bit, that's okay. We just want this pocket to lay really flat as you sew it. Okay, so there's an optional feature with the outside pocket. If you want to attach a loop field for patches, this is the time to do it. We need to put that down before we actually sew the outside pocket to the main piece of the pouch. And on the pattern piece for the pockets, I have hook and loop placement here. And so what I'm gonna do is put this down, center it as best I can on top of this larger pocket. Okay, so I've transferred the loop field placement markings to this bigger pocket. I'm going to change the thread color on my machine to black just so it matches, but that's not totally necessary. Just know that if you're using gray or a different color of thread, those stitches are going to show on this loop field. I'm going to go ahead and just edge stitch this in place. We're looking for about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the loop, and that's where we're going to be sewing. Okay, now we need to transfer the exterior pocket placement markings to the exterior of the pouch. So this is our right side of our pouch. We're going to edge stitch roughly a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch from the edge of this pocket. We're going to edge stitch both long sides of this pocket to your main pattern piece. All right, so again, our main focus at this point is to try to keep this edge straight on our marks, but also to make sure that the pocket is really flat. And you'll see why in just a bit when we close up the bottom of the pockets. Okay, so now both of our pockets are stitched in place, and the last step is to sew the seams that are going to close up the bottom of both pockets, because otherwise right now these are basically like a tube, something could fit all the way through. So if you notice on the pattern piece, there's a couple of lines here that say bottom stitch line. We want to transfer these two marks to the right side of the exterior pocket. And if it's easier for you to use the pattern piece to do that, you could transfer the lines, you could poke some holes and transfer the lines that way. But what I'm going to do here is the outside pocket should be 12 inches long, and so I'm just going to mark the center point at 6 on both sides. And then the bottom marks here are 2 inches apart, and this ruler happens to be 2 inches wide. So I'm going to place my ruler here and going to make a mark here, and we're going to make a mark on the other side. 2 lines of stitching are going to go here 2 inches apart, and that's going to close up the bottom of both outside pockets, and it's going to close up the inside pockets at the same time. This fabric is kind of stiff and it doesn't really move too much. If you're using a fabric that kind of shifts and moves, you want to be careful that your pocket doesn't start to shift and actually kind of build up some extra fabric as you approach the stitch line. That can happen with certain fabrics, and so you want to just make sure that your pocket stays really flat as you sew it. That might require you to kind of hold it back here a little bit, hold it back here, just to make sure you don't get your fabric bunching as you approach this side of the big pocket. Okay, this is what our project should look like at this point. Both the outside and the inside pockets have been sewn down, and you can see that the bottoms have been closed up on both the interior and the exterior pockets. So that does it for the pockets. And up next we have the zipper. There are 2 ways to finish the zipper seam. The zipper is going to be sewn along these long straight edges on each side. And if you're using a fabric that doesn't fray very much, then you can skip this step. But if you are using a fabric that frays, or you just want to have a nice finished look, then you kind of need to decide now how you want to finish the zipper seam. If you're not going to use a binding, then you would want to use a zigzag stitch or a serger along these seams to keep them from fraying. After we sew the zipper tape to these 2 long sides, I'm going to use this binding on each side to finish that seam. And this is kind of a good time to practice this sort of finish because these seams are straight, we're not going over any curves. And so anyway, I'm going to go ahead and bind this seam when we're finished with it, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But if you're not using a binding, then you would want to go ahead and finish these long seams now with either a zigzag stitch or a serger if you have one. The zipper is going to be sewn to these long edges, and that long edge is 15¼ long. So I've already cut my zipper tape to that length, and what we want to do next is to separate the zipper halves. So just go ahead and pull the 2 halves apart, and we're going to be sewing those to each side coming up here in just a minute. I want to talk a little bit about the seam allowance and the width of your zipper tape for this step, and it's kind of important. So the pattern has 3/8 of an inch seam allowance built into this edge here, and the pattern calls for a number 5 zipper. Most number 5 zipper tapes are 1¼ inch wide. So what that means is if I put my zipper tape up against this edge here and sew this at 3/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance for this edge, and I do that on both sides, then we'll have 1/2 inch of exposed zipper in the finished pouch. This is just a sample that I sewed. I sewed several of these testing out this pattern, and you can see here that we have 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape in the finished pouch. And that's important because the pouch is supposed to be 2 inches wide, and you want to maintain 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape so that this is the right width and that up here, this is the right width. If you have a zipper tape that is narrower than 1.25 inches, some zipper tape might be 1 inch wide, some zipper tape might be might be closer to 2 inches wide. If you're using a narrower or a wider zipper tape, then we need to compensate the seam allowance here either way. So let's pretend you're using a 1 inch zipper instead, a 1 inch wide zipper tape instead of 1.25 inches like the pattern calls for. What you'd want to do is offset this a little bit. So instead of sewing with your zipper tape flush with the edge of this long piece here, then you would want to set it back about 1/8 inch. So if you're using this is for a 1 inch zipper. And when you sew this, you would want to make sure that you offset this by about 1/8 inch. So it looks something like this as it goes through the machine instead of the edges being together. And what that will do is make sure that we're still sewing 3/8 inch onto the pattern here, which is what I call for, but you're only sewing 1/4 inch into the zipper tape. And that's for a narrower 1 inch zipper. That way, when you finish this seam, you'll still have 1/2 inch of exposed zipper. The opposite would be true if you're using a wider zipper tape. So if your zipper tape is closer to 2 inches, then you would need to trim off the appropriate amount from this zipper tape so that you can still sew here with 3/8 inch and you can still maintain 1/2 inch of exposed zipper. Okay, once you've determined which way you need to deal with your zipper tape, then we're gonna go ahead and place your zipper tape on each side of your main pouch piece here. And we're gonna make sure that the right side of your main pouch piece is facing up and that the right side of your zipper tape is facing down. So we're gonna put right sides together, clip both sides in place, and we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew this zipper tape to the pouch at 3/8 inch seam allowance. So make sure you have your zipper foot on your machine and I will see you there. We have both sides of the zipper stitched to our main pouch piece, and now is when we're going to bind that seam to finish it. So I have 2 pieces of 3/4 inch grosgrain ribbon seam tape binding here. And I've actually cut mine. This seam is 15.25 inches long. I've cut this to 15.5 inches just to give us a little bit extra. Sometimes the binding likes to shift around a little bit as we're sewing. But cut 2 pieces of your binding to about 15.5 inches long. And I'm gonna use the same technique that we used when we folded over the edges of our pockets. And take your binding and take something kind of hard like the handle of a pair of scissors, and I'm going to fold this binding in half. Try to fold it as accurately in half as possible, and I'm just going to help make a crease on that binding with the handle of the scissors, and I'm going to do that all the way down on both pieces, the full length of both pieces of binding. It's not going to stay, it's still going to open up, but it's going to help us, help us get that binding over the seam. And if you pre-crease it a little bit, it tends to stay a little bit more in place as you sew it. So I've clipped the binding over these 2 layers on this zipper seam, and we're going to go to the sewing machine. We're going to sew this binding down at 1/8 inch from the edge of the binding. 2 things we want to pay attention to here. We want to make sure that we're catching the other layer on the back side, and we want to make sure that as we sew this binding, the fold of the binding, that it stays pretty tight to those 2 layers inside. We don't want the binding to kind of drift off of the pouch like this. We want to make sure that binding stays tight and that we're catching the other side of the binding as we sew. Okay, so we're here on the machine. I've got my regular presser foot back on, and I've got this situated so that as we sew, I'm going to be sewing about 1/8 inch over from the edge of this binding. Okay, so the binding has been stitched in place on both sides. And at this point, if you have a little bit of extra zipper tape or a little bit of extra binding hanging over the edge like I have here, we want to go ahead and just trim that off flush with the end of this piece. So I'm going to do that now. You do that on all of 4 sides. Just make sure that it's flush with your main pouch piece here. And the next step after this is to top stitch this zipper seam. The top stitching is pretty important. It's going to help that zipper seam lay really flat, and it's going to help your zipper slider slide a little bit more smoothly. So what we want to do once our ends here are trimmed cleanly, you want to take this zipper seam and we're going to press it to the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to press it to the back side and just kind of finger press this in place as best you can. Do that on both sides. And when we top stitch, we're going to be top stitching from the edge of this seam about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch inwards like this. And when you do that, you want to make sure that this seam back here is pushed flat to the pouch. So we want this seam facing down, and we're going to top stitch all the way along here. We've got my regular presser foot on. I've changed my thread color to gray to kind of match this fabric, and I'm going to try and stitch about 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch this way for our top stitching. And again, this seam here is laying flat and that seam allowance is facing this way. When it comes to top stitching, one thing you might want to consider is to increase your stitch length just a little bit. It tends to look a little bit nicer. A top stitching looks a little bit nicer sometimes when your stitch length is just a little bit longer than a medium stitch length. If medium is like 2.5, you might increase your stitch length to 3 or maybe 3.5 when you top stitch. Okay, so the next step here is to install our zipper sliders. So with the wrong side facing up, what you want to do is fold both ends of your pouch like this so that the ends of your zipper tape are even. And I'm going to go ahead and use 2 zipper sliders. I want my pouch to be able to open from both sides. You can use 1 if you only have 1, that's totally up to you. And at this point, it doesn't really matter which way it goes on. So this can be a little bit frustrating to get these on, but there's a wider end of the zipper slider, and you're going to feed each end of your zipper tape into that wider end. And the main thing you want to pay attention to here is that the edges of this zipper seam, the edges of your fabric right here, that these are even when your zipper goes on. If you get your zipper slider on and they're off like this, they're skewed a little bit, then you're going to have a skewed zipper seam in your final pouch, and you don't want that. So make sure, if you have to undo it and do it a couple times, it's totally fine. When your zipper pulls go on, make sure that these 2 edges of your fabric on both sides are even. So I'm going to give this a couple of tries. There we go, it just went on. And you can see that the edges of my fabric here are even with the slider or the zipper pull going on. So I'm going to go over to the other side, do that one, and okay, you see this one? This one went on and they're uneven. So I need to take that off. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to sew this seam, and your zipper pouch is going to be skewed like this if you put your slider on and these edges are uneven. So take your time here, make sure you get this part right so that your zipper is fully functional and doesn't look weird. Okay, that looks pretty even on this side. Might be off by, it's off by 1 zipper tooth here, but the fabric itself is actually even, and that's what we want. Go ahead and you can zip this. You can zip this up like this, and we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, with our zipper pulls on the zipper tape, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about this area of the pouch as the upper gusset. This is going to be the part that's on top of the pouch when it's finished. So I'm calling this the upper gusset. And then down below here, these two flaps I'm referring to as the lower gusset. This will be the bottom of the pouch when it's finished. You can fold the upper part out of the way if it's helpful. Just working on this lower part of the pouch, this lower gusset area, and these flaps right here that don't have any zipper or anything on them. We want to mark a 1-inch line on the right side of the fabric on both sides. Okay, so the next step here is optional, but if you want to have a little loop on your pouch, this is the sample, one of the samples I made when testing this pattern. I installed these little loops down here. They can be nice for holding on to when you're opening the zipper, and they can also work as a place to hang this pouch. If you wanted to put some kind of little hook through here and hang the pouch, I put one on each side, and you don't have to do this, it's totally optional, but if you want to, what you need are 2 pieces of your grosgrain ribbon seam binding, and these are the width of this lower gusset here. So they're 3 inches and a quarter, 3.25 inches. You want to cut 2 pieces of this, and then we're going to fold them in half. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and just top stitch these together so that it forms a double layer loop like this. And I'm just going to top stitch this in place. Really, I'm edge stitching. It's about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch over that I'm trying to sew here. What we want to do here is I want to place each one of these 1/4 of an inch up from this corner, and we're going to clip it in place. Okay, so we're doing this on the right side of your pouch, the right side of the fabric, and I've placed this little loop about 1/4 of an inch away from the corner here. I've done that. I'm going to do that on both sides. Then we're going to go to the machine and we're just going to baste this in place. Basting is just temporary stitches to hold something in place while you sew other things. The main thing to be careful of here, you want to make sure you don't sew through that upper gusset area. You don't want to sew through any of that upper gusset that has the zipper in it. So you can fold that out of the way. Mine is kind of peeking out over here. So fold that out of the way. We just want to put a few stitches right on the edge of that loop to secure it in place while we sew other stuff. And I'm going to do that on this side, and then I'm going to do it on the other side of the pouch. Okay, so at this point, you should have your 1-inch lines marked here and here. And if you're doing the optional zipper pull tabs or little loops here, these should be basted to this lower gusset area about 1/4 of an inch from this corner. From here, what we want to do is we want to turn the whole pouch so that the wrong sides are facing out. And it might be helpful to open up your zipper here a little bit. To do that, just be careful. Hold these ends because as you turn this, the zipper slider might want to slide off the end. Okay, now that we have the wrong side facing out, what we want to do, we're going to come to our 1-inch mark here on the right side. With the right sides together, we're going to take the right side of the upper zipper gusset, and we're going to place it to the right side of the lower zipper gusset, right on that 1-inch line. So the end of this is butted up right against your 1-inch line. If the upper gusset is a little bit wider than your lower gusset, just center the difference on each side. I've got about a 1/16 of an inch difference on each side. That happens sometimes, not a big deal. Then we want to pin or clip that in place. And we want to do that on both sides. Okay, so your pouch should look something like this at the moment. We are going to go to the machine and we're going to sew this seam right here. We're going to sew the upper gusset to the lower gusset right sides together, and we're going to sew at 1/4 of an inch from the end of this upper gusset. All right, so I've got this on the machine and we have our 1-inch sticking out here. We've got the end of the upper gusset aligned with our 1-inch mark, and we're going to sew across here at 1/4 of an inch away from this upper gusset seam. When you get to these really thick areas over the grosgrain and the zipper teeth, it's totally fine to hand crank your machine. In fact, I recommend it. It will help your machine not bind up if the needle gets stuck on a dense area or gets stuck on a zipper tooth and you're giving the pedal a lot of juice, you can bind up your machine. So I'm always in favor of hand cranking over those really thick areas, and it'll prevent you from snapping needles every now and then. And we want to do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, so the next step here, what we want to do, after we've sewn both of these, the upper and lower gussets together on both sides, the next step here is to take this extra seam allowance, and what we're going to do is fold it in half. We're folding this edge here to this edge of the seam here. Don't fold it all the way to the stitches. We're just folding the edge of the excess seam allowance to the edge of that upper gusset. So we're folding it in half once, and then we're going to fold it in half again. This time we fold to the stitches so that we finish that seam. And from there, make sure you just clip that in place. And we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. If you wanted to, you could clip that extra seam allowance off. You could just trim this off, and you could finish this with a piece of binding. That's totally an option. I decided to add on this extra seam allowance here because I know some people probably aren't using a binding even for the zipper seam. So if that's you, then we have this extra seam allowance here to work with. Plus it's just kind of a different, it's an additional kind of seam to learn how to do on a pouch like this. Sometimes you add a little bit of extra seam allowance so that it can fold over on itself and finish a seam. And I just wanted to add that in here on this project so that you know how to do it. Okay, so I've got this on the sewing machine, and the next step here, we want to stitch down this folded over seam allowance to finish off this zipper seam. And I'm edge stitching here. I'm really stitching about a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch from this fold this way, and we've got the rest of the pouch folded out of the way. So we're not sewing through to the right side of the fabric at all. We're really just sewing within this seam allowance, that original upper and lower gusset seam. We're sewing within that allowance, not to the outside of the pouch. So I'm gonna go ahead and top stitch this in place, or edge stitch, if you will. It's about let's say an 1/8 of an inch from this fold, and that should ensure that we're not sewing into the outside of the pouch. We're just sewing within that seam allowance. And we have a fair number of layers in place now. This is kind of the thickest part of this project. So as I mentioned before, when you approach this binding and the zipper teeth, I'm gonna hand crank mine just to protect my machine a little bit. Takes a little bit longer, but I think it's the way to go. Okay, so at this point, our pouch would look like this. We have this really nice clean finish on our zipper ends. And at this point, what we want to do is open up your pouch all the way, and we're going to flip it so that the right side is facing out. Okay, at this point, what we need to do is sew up our side seams. And a lot of times when we're sewing, we put the right sides together and sew a seam, and that's generally how it's done. But in this case, what we're going to do is a thing called a French seam. And with a French seam, basically the idea here is we put the wrong sides together and we sew from the right side. We're gonna sew this seam at 1/4 of an inch, and then we're gonna flip the whole pouch wrong side out, and we're gonna sew it again at 3/8 of an inch, and it will enclose that raw edge. It'll enclose this raw edge and make for a really nice seam. And I wanted to include that here just to show another option for finishing seams. So to get going here, what we want to do is flatten out the side seam so that this corner here and this corner here are completely laying flat. And it should look like a 45-degree angle there and a 45-degree angle there. And we want to clip that in place. Make sure that inside here, that this zipper gusset seam is facing down, okay? We wanna make sure that that seam is facing down when we sew these side seams. And I'm gonna go ahead and clip this together. Again, just make sure that these corners are laying really flat. You don't want the corner skewed, at all like this, okay? You wanna make sure that this corner is really crisp, and it should form a perfect 45-degree angle here when you have it in the right place. Go ahead and clip that together. We wanna make sure that we're sewing from this edge over pretty accurately at 1/4 inch. The seam allowance here is really important so that we get the right finish and that our bag stays the right dimensions. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew this now. Okay, getting ready to sew side number 2 here, and you might find it's easier to do this to get your edges lined up if you unzip your pouch fully. With my thick fabric, that's something that I needed to do to make sure that I got my the edges of this side seam lined up properly. At this point, our project should look like this. We have all 4 side seams sewn together, and we've done that from the right side of the pouch, and we've just sewn these at 1/4 inch all the way up and down. You want to be as accurate as possible here. You can see I actually had to go back and re-sew part of mine to make this a full 1/4 inch. And the next step from here is to turn the pouch so that the wrong side is facing out. So we want to make sure that the wrong side is facing out, and we want to make sure that these side seams have been fully opened up. So it's kind of a good idea, just kind of push your finger into each corner to make sure that those have fully opened. And then what we want to do is just kind of finger press each of these 4 side seams as flat as possible. Okay, with those seams pressed flat, the next step, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew from the wrong side. So our right sides will be together on the inside of the pouch, and what we want to do, the first time around we sewed at 1/4 inch, this time around we're sewing at 3/8 of an inch. What that's going to do, it's going to fully enclose the raw edges of your fabric on the inside. So we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew each side seam again at 3/8 of an inch, and this completes what I was talking about earlier, the French seam, and it's just a good way to, it's a good finish to know about. You can use it in various ways. Down here on this side, when you get to this area, you might want to hand crank your machine a little bit. There are a fair number of layers where this seam intersects with this seam. Okay, so at this point we should have all 4 of the side seams sewn for a second time. The second time we sewed at 3/8 of an inch from the edge, and now it's time to turn the whole pouch right side out. You can go ahead and just kind of poke out each corner with your fingers. No need to use anything else to do it with this kind of seam. Make sure the bottoms are fully turned. We're almost finished. You can hear those zippers jangling. The last step is to take some paracord and put it on our zipper pulls here. We've got 2 pieces of paracord. I've cut these at 11 inches long, and I've taken a lighter and just melted the ends on these so that it doesn't fray. And I'm going to attach these to each of the zipper pulls. So on a smaller number 5 zipper head like this, I think the best way, the easiest way, is to stick it through the bottom hole first, so it looks like that, and then take one of the ends through the top, and you want to even out the zipper pull at top, and then I just like to tie a double knot. And I like to try to slide the knot as close as I can down to the end of the zipper pull like so. All right, and I'm gonna cut off the excess here in a little bit. 11 inches is actually way too long, but you need that extra length to get your knot tied. So we're gonna do the same thing over here. Okay, so the last part here, I like to go ahead and cut this off, cut off these extra tails. You could leave them long if you want to, but I'm gonna cut mine off at about 1/2 inch from the knot. And I'm gonna do that on both sides. And if you cut this, I would highly recommend taking a lighter and melting the ends of your zipper pull or the paracord just like this, because this stuff frays really quick, and it's kind of nice to melt that so that it doesn't fray all over the place. And that's your pouch, packed for travel or ready for everyday carry. You made that yourself and you should be really proud of it. If you make one, I genuinely love to see it. Tag me on Instagram at TaylorTaylor. Seeing what y'all make is honestly one of the best parts of this project. The pattern with full written instructions and diagrams is at taylortaylor.com. The link is in the description whenever you're ready to sew. If you enjoyed this and want to see what we build next, subscribe so you don't miss it. We've got a lot more gear to make together. Thanks for sewing with me. See you next time.